And so in November 1918, the First World War comes to an end. France has been devastated. A quarter of all the men that had been aged between 18 and 30 in France at the start of the war are now dead. The economic heartland of France, the north, has been ruined, with factories destroyed and mines flooded. The French are determined they will punish Germany for this. The French ally, the great Tsarist Russian state, has collapsed into communism. Lenin initially commits the USSR to an expansionist policy, starting with an assault upon the new state of Poland in the Polish-Soviet War of 1919 to 21. The British, however, are highly suspicious of the French, and in particular French aims in Europe. And the British are keen for Germany to recover as a trading partner, but also to act as a bulwark against communist Russia. Whereas the Americans, they're committed to the idea of a just and fair peace, but they simply fail to understand the difficulties that this poses, especially the difficulties posed by Europe's complex ethnic borders. Nor do they understand or indeed sympathise with French fears of invasion, for the French have already been invaded in the 1871 war, the Franco-Prussian War, and of course in the First World War, and they're determined to avoid being invaded again. And so the world meets in Paris, in the Palace of Versailles, to discuss what to do with Germany. The Treaty of Versailles follows, and the result is a peace treaty that appeases no one. Some said that it's too harsh, and so hopefully you can see the map that's coming up here of German territorial losses in the Treaty of Versailles. Starting with the French border, Alsace and Lorraine are given to France. The towns of Eupen and Malmedy are given to Belgium. In the north, North Schleswig is handed over to Denmark, which of course hadn't fought in the First World War. In the east, West Prussia, Posen and parts of Upper Silesia are given to Poland, while Memel is handed to another new country of Lithuania. The Germans are also stripped of all of their colonies around the world. And so if we look at Africa, the British take Tanganyika, some of Togoland and the Cameroons, while South Africa takes Namibia. Now even Britain's colonies have colonies of their own. France takes the rest of Togoland and the Cameroons, whereas Belgium takes Rwanda, Urundi, and Portugal is given the Kayanga Triangle. In the Pacific, the Japanese, one of the oldest allies, but not the oldest ally of the British, take all the German Empire north of the equator, while Samoa goes to New Zealand, New Guinea and Samoa, as well as the Bismarck Archipelago, are handed over to Australia. And also the Germans are made to pay reparations, a bill for the damage they have done to Belgium and to France. And the reparations figure was set at the eye-watering rate of £6.6 billion. More than this, the German armed forces are to be considerably constrained. The German Navy is to be limited to only 6 battleships, at a time when the Royal Navy has some 72. And none of these are to be new-built warships. Their army, the pride of Germany, is limited to 100,000 men, a large army by modern standards, but small for the 20th century. An army of 100,000 men for the time is equivalent only to the army of Belgium. In no way could it defend Germany. They're also banned from conscription, banned from having an air force, banned from having tanks, banned from owning submarines. However, as harsh as this appears, as the German historian Peckart has pointed out, in reality, the peace treaty is rather reasonable compared to what the Germans had prepared to inflict upon other nations. And so if we compare it to the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk that the surrendered Russian government had to sign with the Germans, then in fact this is quite lenient. And Barnett, the great British historian, has pointed out that in reality, in many ways, the German state of 1919 is actually stronger than the German state of 1914. Now that might sound controversial, but consider the position of Germany in 1919. The small size of Germany's military means that a lot of money is saved, so that with their reduced defence expenditure, they could easily afford to pay the reparations bills if they wish. And they're now bordered by much weaker states. Instead of Germany being surrounded by states like Russia and Austro-Hungary, now their borders are with countries like Poland and Lithuania, who are far less capable of posing a threat to Germany and its long-term future. And when we look at what the Germans had imposed upon the defeated Russians, the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, that indeed had been an incredibly harsh treaty. Russia had been forced to hand over 1/3 of its population, half of all its industry, and an eye-watering 90% of all its coal deposits to a victorious Germany. And we can have no doubt that had Germany beaten Britain and France too, then there would have been similar incredibly harsh peace treaties imposed on the British and the French. And so the historian Thompson points out that not only was the Treaty of Versailles less harsh than it could have been, we also forget, with our Anglo-centric view, you'll find a lot of people who will study this time period who will say, they shouldn't have given so much land to other countries, and in particular, they shouldn't have reduced Germany to the east. But it's easy to forget that the Treaty of Versailles finally gives freedom to a lot of the countries of Eastern Europe. For instance, the Polish peoples were finally freed by the Treaty of Versailles from German tyranny. If we accept the idea that we should have been less harsh to Germany after the First World War, then we have the question of Poland. Why should Poland not have its freedom after the defeat of Germany? And so, although it is a highly disappointing treaty, it is indeed the worst of all compromises, a peace treaty that punishes Germany enough to really anger the Germans, but doesn't punish the Germans enough to stop them from being a great power, and so allows Germany to rise and recover, to try and challenge the world yet again. We must understand that they are attempting to give freedom to the Eastern European states, to punish Germany for the war, to undo the damage done to France and to Belgium. And with these competing demands, you have this very disappointing compromise peace. And so the 1920s. The 1920s begin with a troubled start. Greece and Turkey go to war in 1919 to 23, resulting in the first of the post-First World War peace treaties unravelling. From 1919 to 21, Britain finds itself locked into a war for Irish independence, and Britain comes close itself to war with Turkey in 1922 in the Munich Crisis. But Britain is working hard for peace via disarmament in this time period. There is, however, a threat for a new naval arms race between Britain and America. The Royal Navy is the dominant force in the oceans of the world. However, America's power and prestige has been rising throughout the latter years of the First World War, and America has become determined that it will have the paramount position in terms of the world's navies. America is determined to challenge Britain for control of the seas. Britain, with its vast empire, is equally determined that it will hold on to its control of the world's sea lanes, for the future of the British Empire depends on it. And so Britain and America both plan an incredible new program of naval construction, with the British planning massive new battleships designed to be able to wrest control of the seas off the American coast. Of course, one of the causes of the First World War had been a dangerous naval arms race between Britain and Germany, and now it appears that Britain and America, the only two countries that are still in 1918 capable of dominating the globe at that time, seem to be about to slip into a new naval arms race that could one day lead to war. The American plan for war, by the way, Plan Red, called for a massive poison gas attack on Canada to kill enough civilians to stop the British Army from being able to unload into Canada to invade America. The threat of war is very real between Britain and America after the First World War. And so in an effort to avoid this naval arms race, and also to reduce the cost of the British defence establishment, the British and the Americans sit down to talk in 1921. And the result is the Washington Naval Treaty of 1921. The British and the Americans agree that they will both have equal numbers of battleships. For the first time, the Royal Navy has lost its supremacy of the seas. Now it has parity with the USA. And Japan, that rising naval power in the East, is allowed to build up a formidable naval force. However, the Americans are worried that Britain and Japan, old allies, will simply unite against them. And so, as a price of the Americans agreeing parity with the Royal Navy, the British are forced to abandon and scrap their alliance with Japan in 1922. This will have fatal consequences for the British, for Japan will be incredibly hurt about being abandoned in this way. And it will realise that the British Empire in the East is exposed to Japanese ambitions, and hence the British will start work on a new naval base at Singapore to defend her imperial possessions out east. However, throughout the 1920s, the British government is mostly concerned with British economic difficulties and with imperial policing. The First World War had increased the national debt 12-fold, up to a horrible burden of 172% of the British GDP, which I know our national debt now is above 172% of GDP, but nonetheless it is an eye-watering level of debt. And by the late 1920s, interest payments on the war debt alone, just the interest payments, are accounting for some 40% of all government spending. The British economy is dependent on industries that are now in near terminal decline: steel, shipbuilding, coal and textiles. And the armed forces, as the British government attempts to cope with this huge debt and this struggling economy, is forced to accept the 10-year rule. This means that defence spending from now on is to assume that the British armed forces will not have to fight a major conflict for the next 10 years. This allows the British government to slash defence spending from 30% of the government budget in 1913 to some 10% in 1933. The 10-year rule would not be scrapped until 1932, and defence spending would not increase in any significant form until 1937. In 1938, it would still only be around 4% of GDP to defend the largest empire in world history. In 1923, the French and the Belgians occupied the economic heartland of Germany, the Ruhr. So we have here before you a map of Europe as it is in 1920. Germany in 1922 was made to start its reparations payments, but in 1923 it refused to hand over the second tranche of payments. Yes, when it refused to hand over timber supplies that were to be used to rebuild France and Belgium. The French and Belgians decided to occupy the Ruhr to take what they're owed. The British government opposed the action. The German Chancellor, Kuno, however, had deliberately decided to make Germany default on its payments as a test of will of the British and French governments to actually enforce the terms of the Treaty of Versailles. The French Prime Minister, Poincaré, argued that once Germany had broken free of Versailles, it would plunge the world into a new war. The Germans respond with passive resistance. We see here French troops occupying the Ruhr. The German government tell the people of the Ruhr not to go to work, that the government will pay them to stay at home, and it will find the money to do this by printing more money. The result of this, of course, is hyperinflation. This here is a famous picture you should be able to see: German children playing with worthless paper money. You'll find pictures of people burning banknotes to cook their food, or wallpapering their houses in banknotes, because the banknotes were worth less than wallpaper, or indeed to turn your oven on. And so these children here, they look rich, but they can't afford building blocks, but they can afford these huge piles of money. And of course, at times, men are having to take wheelbarrows to their place of work to fill the wheelbarrows full of money to take their half day's pay home. And when they leave it outside their houses, they find that thieves have upended the wheelbarrow, left the money on the doorstep, and ran off with the wheelbarrow itself, which is more valuable than the paper currency. All this is caused by the hyperinflation led by the created by the printing of money to pay for the passive resistance to the French and Belgian armies who have occupied the Ruhr. Eventually, Weimar Germany, democratic Germany, is forced to back down and agree to pay its reparations, triggering the first effort by the Nazi Party to take control in what's known as the Beer Hall Putsch, or the Munich Putsch of 1923. However, internationally, France was seen as the aggressor, attempting imperialism in Europe, picking on poor, defenceless Germany. The British and the United States waged economic warfare on the French, forcing it to agree eventually to a reduction in Germany's reparations payments in what was known as the Dawes Plan of 1924. In 1925, the Locarno Treaty was signed. France and Germany both agreed that Germany's new western borders with France were fair, and that Britain and Italy would attack whichever nation tried to invade the other. So if Germany tried to invade France, Britain and Italy would declare war on Germany. But critically, also, if France invaded Germany, then Britain and Italy would go to the defence of Germany. This was hugely significant for Germany, for they are now being treated as equals to France. But it's also very significant for the nations of Eastern Europe. Poland was furious, for it was very obvious that Locarno said that Germany's new western borders were fair. Germany refused to say anything about its eastern borders, and the silence of its issue on its borders between Germany and Poland were pointed. The Poles were furious. They wanted an eastern Locarno for Germany to accept her new borders in the east were fair, but the German government refused to do so. In 1929, the Young Plan further reduced Germany's reparations payments by 20%. But in 1929, everything changed. Now we should see here in front of us the map of the British Empire as it stands in 1921, largely at its peak, to give you some idea of the extent of Britain's imperial policing strain, that this vast empire was to be defended with just an expenditure of 4% of Britain's GDP. And we have here a map of Europe as it will stand in 1936. But things change in 1929 with what is known as the Wall Street crash in the United States, which leads to a global recession known as the Great Depression. Global trade falls by 50%. It is the largest and deepest depression of the 20th century. Now, Germany had become highly dependent for its economic recovery, which had been impressive, on American loans. It had borrowed, in fact, twice the value of its reparations bill from the United States from 1925 to 1928. So that's worth considering when Germany claims it couldn't afford to pay its reparations. It had been given twice that much money, or lent twice that much money rather, by the Americans in just 3 years. But in 1929, the Americans want the money they have lent Germany back. With the ceasing of American loans and America attempting and largely failing to call in its debts, the German economy collapses. By 1933, unemployment in Germany would reach around 6 million people out of work. The governments of Brüning, von Papen and Schleicher would all fail to deal with the crisis, bringing Hitler to power in 1933. Meanwhile, in the East, Japan was devastated as well. It saw that its neighbour China was weak, only just beginning to emerge from a civil war. In 1931, Japan would invade the Chinese province of Manchuria. Britain felt that it alone had to try and preserve the peace. We have here the words of the Foreign Office in 1926. We have no territorial ambitions. We have got all that we want, perhaps more. Our sole aim is to keep what we have and live in peace. The USA had retreated into self-interested isolation, whereas the French were concerned with their efforts to dominate the continent of Europe. The USSR was seen as an expansionist threat, as were the empires of Italy and Japan. While unknown to the British, Hitler wanted the greatest possible of all Germanies, stretching from the Rhine to the River Volga in Russia, and a world empire at least equal to that of the British. And yet, although the British feel that they alone have to keep the peace, they fatally lack the confidence that's required to preserve the peace. We have here the words of Bonner-Law, the Conservative Party leader of 1922. We cannot alone act as policemen of the world. In 1922, the Chief of the Imperial General Staff, Sir Henry Wilson, said, "Our small army is much too scattered. In no one single theatre are we strong enough." And in 1931, the Admiralty advised the British government that the Navy's strength was below that required to keep the sea lanes open in the event of war. But was a war going to be necessary? In 1935, Britain and Germany were to reach a naval agreement, which would allow the German fleet to grow to be equal to 35% of the Royal Navy. Hitler said, "An Anglo-German combination will be stronger than all other powers." But this, for the British, is the danger. The British saw the Anglo-German naval treaty as a step towards world peace. Hitler saw it as a first step to a British-German alliance against France and the USSR. Certainly Britain could have avoided fighting Germany. We have here Sir Eric Phipps, ambassador to Germany. Hitler displayed an almost touching solitude to the welfare of the British Empire, while Hitler also told Phipps' replacement, Sir Neville Henderson, "I've always wanted a British-German understanding." As Hitler told Halder, head of the German General Staff in 1938, "If we crush England's military power, the British Empire will collapse. That is no use to Germany, but will benefit only Japan and the USA." While Britain did declare war, or rather when Britain did declare war, Hitler said he couldn't grasp what the English were really after, as even if England won, then the real victors would be the USA, Japan, and the USSR. Ultimately, Britain could have avoided fighting Germany, but only by accepting German dominance of the continent in full alliance with Nazi Germany. In 1940, Goebbels said, "Sooner or later, the racially valuable Germanic elements in Britain would have to be brought in to join Germany in the future struggle of the white race against the yellow, the Germanic against the Bolshevik." And so we have the road to Munich. If a war was to be avoided, Hitler would have to be deterred from starting a war. In 1933, Britain had the most powerful fleet in the world, and the French had the most powerful army. Unfortunately, the two countries are far from united. The Germans, however, were very weak. The French army was excellent. It had created the first mechanized divisions, the DLM, and the first motorized divisions from 1930 to 33 under General Weygand's modernization. That's 2 years before Germany's. In 1932, the French had begun experiments with heavy tanks, and although the French army perceived these experiments as failures, construction on these excellent vehicles continued. So we have here pictures of the French army of 1936 and the Char B1 heavy tanks. In 1934, the French officer de Gaulle wrote a book calling for the creation of armoured divisions in the French army, but also made certain that he'd be ignored in his calls by also calling for France to create a professional volunteer army instead of a citizens' conscript force, something the French Republic, which was terrified of a French military dictatorship, could never accept. What was missing from the British and French was confidence. Instead of the French army preparing to take the offensive, work began on the Maginot Line in 1930. They considered fortifying the border between France and Belgium, but this was rejected by the French government by just one vote. It would have been very expensive, especially the wet coastal strip, and it would have been pointless, as the French and Belgians were allies and had been since 1920. They did consider giving money to the Belgians to build fortifications in Belgium, but this was rejected due to the cost. In 1934, the French started to rearm, ordering the creation of a large air force, but French cottage industry simply couldn't cope with the scale of the demands. They also produced obsolete designs, multi-role aircraft, they referred to as BCRs, that could do everything, but could only do it badly. Due to the financial difficulties of France, however, the pace of rearmament would be cut in 1935, just as Germany was starting to really increase its rate of rearmament. But even so, France was well placed to keep Germany in its place, to stop Germany from a war of expansion. For France had a series of allies. It had an alliance with Belgium, with Czechoslovakia, with Poland, with Romania and Yugoslavia. Germany is encircled by nations determined to stop Germany from expanding. But Britain too lacks confidence. In May 1934, the Defence Committee finally recognised Germany as Britain's biggest threat, but decided against building up a large army to deter Germany. Only 5 divisions were prepared to be sent to help the French. The RAF estimated that if Germany occupied the Low Countries, then the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, could drop 150 tons of bombs a day. In 1936, they increased this assumption to 600 tons of bombs a day being dropped on London. And so 1934, Hitler in power for less than a year, Germany begins to rearm. Hitler tries to seize Austria, the country of his birth, but is stopped when Mussolini moves Italian troops to the Brenner Pass. Germany, however, signs a non-aggression pact with Poland, starting to weaken the French system of alliances. In 1935, you have discussions over what is known as the Stressor Front. We have here a picture of the Maginot Line as it will be constructed to protect France. And we have here a map of Abyssinia. And so the Stressor Front of 1935, April. Britain, France and Italy announced their commitment to keep Austria free. The three of them will protect Austria from Germany. The French general Gamelin and the Italian general Bagdolo began military conversations against Germany. Now the French need Italy's help, if they're to help their Eastern European allies. With Italian railways, French troops could be on the Danube in weeks to help protect Yugoslavia, the Czechoslovakia, and ultimately Poland. Also, the Italian Navy could help protect the French Empire and also release 15 French divisions from the French-Italian border. An Italian alliance would be incredibly useful for France and its system of alliances. The Americans, however, had already begun the appeasement of Hitler. One of FDR's first acts as president was to offer Germany the Polish corridor, which of course he had no authority to do. The Polish government would never agree to that. And also to increase oil exports to Germany by 300%. The United States of America was, by 1935, supplying half of Germany's oil, and also depending upon the materials between 25 and 75% of its strategic militarily necessary raw materials. The relations between Britain and France were still not good. A popular pamphlet was produced in France calling for England to be reduced to slavery. But any hopes France had in a long war against Germany would rest on the British. The British disliked French politicians, but knew they could not let France down, although they believed that part of the hostility between the British, French and Germans had in fact been caused by the French bullying of the Germans in the 1920s. In May 1935, France and the USSR signed a Mutual Assistance Act. The USSR had offered a full alliance, a full military alliance to France, but the French had rejected an alliance, as the French military had a low opinion of the Red Army. They didn't want, however, a German-Soviet alliance, so they tried to string talks out to keep the Russians hopeful that they'd one day gain an alliance with France. But the purge of the officers of the Red Army by Stalin would bring an end to these talks. In October 1935, Italy invaded the East African country of Abyssinia. Maybe because Naval, the French Prime Minister, had offered Mussolini a free hand in Africa. He had certainly in discussions been very vague, but had probably thought that Mussolini could get what he wanted without resorting to war. The British, however, had not been consulted about this offer, and the British were outraged by the Italian invasion of Abyssinia. Also, the French popular opinion was horrified, and this forced the French government to impose sanctions on Italy. However, these sanctions were woefully ineffective, but they needn't have been. The British and French controlled the Suez Canal, the only way the Italians could even get to a considerable military force to get to Abyssinia. They could have simply have closed the Suez Canal to Italian shipping and Italian forces. They didn't. They allowed Italian forces to sail through the Suez Canal to get to Abyssinia. The Italians were dependent on British and French coal and oil supplies. They could have cut them and ended the war, but they did not. However, they did impose an arms embargo, but they imposed the arms embargo on both Italy and Abyssinia, which meant that it was impossible now for Abyssinia to buy in modern weapons to try and protect their country. Despite these efforts, however, Naval's government fell, to be replaced by a left-wing coalition in France that hated Mussolini. However, it was also incredibly childish in how it behaved. From 1936 to 38, the French would have no ambassador to Italy as a protest to the invasion. Relations would then worsen when the Italians would help the fascists in the Spanish Civil War of July 1936 to April 1939. And so 1936. In March, Hitler reoccupies the Rhineland. Now, France was hostile and made warlike suggestions, but the British refused to back the French. The French announced that they were ready to fight to keep the Germans out of the Rhineland if the British backed them, but the French would have been truly horrified if Britain had agreed. France was using the British as an excuse for inaction. The incident, however, was a terrible blow to French prestige with its allies, especially as it reduced its ability to interfere on their behalf, and also left the Belgians, the Poles, the Czechs, the Yugoslavs and the Romanians doubting if France even wanted to intervene to protect them. Belgium cancelled its alliance with France after France failed to stop the Germans occupying the Rhineland, as it was unwilling to be drawn into any war with Germany over Central and Eastern Europe. And as this map is going to show, that's a terrible blow to France, as its entire strategy for dealing with the Germans had depended on a French advance through Belgium. If we look at this map here, the French generals are no fools. They know that by building the Maginot Line, that will bring any German invasion of France through Belgium. And so the French intend to use relatively badly equipped forces to hold the Maginot Line, while the best of the French army race into Belgium to hold one of three lines. You have the Albert Canal line, the most ambitious of the plans. If they can advance quickly, they'll be able to seize the Albert Canal, the River Meuse, and protect most of Belgium and its industrial plant for the long war to come. But they've soon rejected the plans for this advance. The most conservative is the E plan, the Escart plan. Now, this will hold the Belgian coast and protect the key industrial French town of Lille. However, it will mean abandoning most of Belgium. There's also the Dial Plan, the D Plan, that will defend Brussels. However, there will be a critical gap known as the Gembloux Gap. If you look at it right in the middle of the line, Gembloux there is the River Dial, there is the Sambre, there is the Meuse. However, there is that gap in the river lines that a German attack could come through. But surely a well-equipped French army backed by Belgians and British could hold the gap. However, with the cancelling of the alliance, suddenly the French might not be given permission to occupy Belgium and to make Belgium its battlefield. And so this is now a terrible blow to French plans. The loss of the Belgian alliance is one of those big moments that really should be in our school textbooks a lot more for this time period than it actually is, as it's a fatal blow to all French military preparations for and plans for a war with Germany. However, now France makes rearmament a top priority, especially concentrating on tanks and bombers. However, the French military budget had already been fully committed. Fortifying the Belgian border was now also unthinkable. There simply wasn't the time to extend the Maginot Line. French rearmament was also thrown into chaos by the French decision to nationalise all of its arms industry. This led, in the short term at least, to a collapse in production. This allowed the Luftwaffe for the first time to overtake the French Air Force in terms of numbers and in terms of quality of its aircraft. For remember, when Hitler came to power, officially Germany had no air force and France had had an extensive one. Now, only 3 years later, the French Air Force is dwarfed by that of the Germans. The French start to court the Polish government and military, especially Marshal Rydz-Śmigły, giving Poland 2 billion francs worth of credit for arms purchases to improve the Polish armed forces. Romania, under its leader Titulescu, suggests hardening what they call the Petit Entente, the alliance between France, Romania, Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Yugoslavia, into a full formal military alliance. But the French are non-committal. What the French want is for these countries to fight for France. They don't want France to have to fight for Poland, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia or Romania, and so they're non-committal and they allow the discussions to peter out. In July, the Spanish Civil War breaks out. France initially wants to send troops to help the Republic, but the British oppose the action as they don't approve of the very left-wing Spanish Republic. The British start to interfere in French domestic politics to make sure that the anti-appeaser Paul Bascourt didn't become foreign minister. In 1937, the Maginot Line is completed, but of course, now it doesn't cover that exposed Belgian border. And so 1938. In March 1938, Germany achieves Anschluss with Austria. The British army budget is actually cut slightly as Germany occupies Austria. In April also, the Anglo-Irish trade agreement is signed. Now, if you are from an Irish family, then you will probably remember the April 1938 Anglo-Irish trade agreement. It's one of the big moments towards full independence for Ireland and leaving behind its ties to Britain, signed by Chamberlain. Chamberlain signs away Britain's rights to what are known as the treaty ports, the ports in the Republic of Ireland, Southern Ireland. This would be disastrous for the British during the Second World War, as those naval bases, but particularly the airfields near those naval bases, would have been incredibly handy for aircraft operating against submarines in the Battle of the Atlantic. The loss of those treaty port bases would widen the gap that we couldn't cover for the Atlantic convoys with our aircraft, and would certainly lead to a massive loss of life in the Second World War. And so the British, as 1938 dawns, are really worsening their military situation, cutting their military budget and losing their rights to the treaty ports, just as Germany occupies Austria. In May of 1938, Czechoslovakia becomes afraid of a German assault. They can see that Germany has reoccupied the Rhineland, they've occupied Austria, and they believe rightly that they are next. and so they decide to mobilize their army. This mobilization from the Czechs leads Chamberlain and the British ambassador to Germany, Henderson, to view Czechoslovakia as the aggressors against Germany. As the tensions in Central Europe rise, Duff Cooper, the British Lord of the Admiralty, asks for permission to mobilise the Royal Navy to prepare it for war, but Chamberlain refuses. The French government asked the British to warn the Germans that Britain and France would fight to protect the Czechs from the Germans, but again, Chamberlain refuses. Instead, he starts to pressurise the Czech government to grant the Sudetenland, that border area between currently part of Czechoslovakia, but with a German-speaking majority, to grant the Sudetenland autonomy, so that it would remain within Czechoslovakia, but have its own devolved parliament, which would then, with its German majority, be able to vote for a government that would look after its interests. However, Hitler, when hearing of this compromise, breaks off negotiations, saying that it won't be enough. He really wants the Sudetenland, and who can blame him? The Sudetenland, with its German majority, is also, however, the thick fortified belt that protects Czechoslovakia. It is a mountainous region, and the Czechs, who knew when their country was created again that the Germans would one day come for them, had spent 20 years pouring concrete and steel into the Sudetenland, fortifying that area in preparation for a German invasion. He really wants those fortifications to be handed over. On the 9th of September, Hitler threatened to invade Czechoslovakia to get what he wanted. The French government said that they will fight, but Chamberlain refuses to back them. Now, many in Britain actually wanted war at this time, which might sound odd. It's not that they're bloodthirsty, it's not that we're seeking to gain anything from Germany, but they're prepared to fight to protect the nations of Central and Eastern Europe. Now, that might be controversial to you. Many school textbooks say that the British public were not behind war. Not the case. If you check the records of the House of Commons debate, the Labour opposition spoke in favour of Britain standing by the League of Nations, the United Nations of the time, to protect the small and weak nations of the world from aggression. It wasn't just the Labour Party that spoke in favour of a defensive war for Czechoslovakia. Churchill in the Conservative Party, also with his gaggle of troublemaking backbenchers, had called to stand. The French government had asked us to stand with Czechoslovakia. The United States had said that they would be friendly and be sympathetic if Britain decided to fight for the Czechs. Even the Pope came out and said that he believed that the British and French had a moral duty to protect the small and weak nations of the world. Henderson, however, our ambassador to Germany, recommended to Chamberlain that the British back down. And so on the 15th of September 1938, Chamberlain and Hitler met. Chamberlain then bullied the French government into giving way. And on the 21st of September, the British and French forced the Czechs to agree to a plebiscite in the Sudetenland. They would have a vote, a free and fair vote for the people of the Sudetenland to see if they wanted to belong to Nazi Germany or Czechoslovakia. The next day, however, the 22nd of September, Hitler rejects that offer. He rejects that deal and asks to be allowed to occupy the Sudetenland without a vote. 6 British cabinet members, including Duff Cooper, Lord of the Admiralty, and Leslie Hoare Belisha, who was the Minister for War, called for Britain to mobilise its armed forces in defence of Czechoslovakia. We have here the words of Henderson, our ambassador to Germany. Hitler is dictating terms just as if he had won a war. The French and Czech governments rejected the German demands. The French government again asked the British government to mobilise, to introduce conscription, and to pool economic and financial resources. Gamelin, the senior French general, visited London and proposes an offensive in the West to help the Czechs. Churchill asks Chamberlain to go and speak to the USSR. Go to speak to the Russians, Churchill said, because the Russians, the USSR, had a mutual defence deal with Czechoslovakia. And so it wouldn't simply have been Britain, France and Czechoslovakia fighting Germany. There is every chance that it could be Britain, France, Czechoslovakia and the USSR fighting Germany. And you see here the map, the political situation in Europe of September 1938. A newspaper poll was published. Now, of course, we all know that you can't trust the polls, and how reliable are these newspaper polls anyway? But a newspaper poll was published showing that the public were broadly pro-war to protect Czechoslovakia, with 40% saying that they were prepared to fight and 22% saying they weren't. The rest said they didn't know where Czechoslovakia was and needed more information. On the 27th of September, the British fleet is mobilised and gas masks are distributed to the British population. Poland, however, makes it clear that it will not fight to help the Czechs. They did have treaties to say that they could fight to help defend the Czechs, but they say that they won't in this case. Yugoslavia and Romania, however, start to make noises to suggest that they might fight to help the Czechs, or will certainly try and find some way to offer assistance to the Czechs. And so with the European situation seemingly getting more favourable for a war situation for Britain and France by the day, the British government of Chamberlain sends Wilson to speak to Hitler. Hitler then rants and raves at Wilson, threatening war with Britain. Chamberlain then, however, starts to back away from the idea of war yet again, asking the Czechs to abandon the Sudetenland, and it's advised by Henderson, the British ambassador to Germany, remember, that the Czech army is badly equipped with low morale. Henderson has an incredibly low opinion of the Czech armed forces and says that there's no way they can hold off the Germans. But critically, Henderson had never seen the Czech army, and they at no stage spoke to the British ambassador to Czechoslovakia about what position the Czech army was actually in. The Czech army in 1938 was actually a first-rate army. We have here in the bottom left some of the fortifications built along the Czech-German border. That's a modern photo. As you can see, they're still there today. They are incredible pieces of military engineering. The Czech army was well motorized and had some excellent tanks. In fact, they had large numbers of excellent tanks. The Czech army was superbly well equipped and very well trained. This equipment was very good. It's the equipment that Germany used itself for the first couple of years of the war. In fact, that tank on the top right is a Czech tank. The Germans continued to use that throughout the war, admittedly due to desperation in 44 to 45, but nonetheless it saw service throughout. The Czechs were building these and in large numbers. However, the British government only spoke to the ambassador to Germany, didn't bother asking its own ambassador to Czechoslovakia about whether the Czechs could have fought off a German attack. Daladier, leader of France, on his way to Munich, goes to speak to his own advisors. Gamelin, the man who would command the French army in any war in 1938, says that he actually personally is opposed to war, as he thinks that it will lead to a modernised Battle of the Somme and a slaughter. The head of the French Air Force, Vallemain, says that the French Air Force effectively is non-existent, that the Germans will swap the French Air Force out of the skies within days of the war beginning. Vallemain is convinced that the Luftwaffe massively overpowers the French Air Force and that they can't defend the skies of France, and so advises Daladier not to go to war with Germany in 1938. It's simply not true, however. Vallemain had visited Germany and visited the airfields of the German Air Force, and he had been shown row after row after row of modern aircraft. What he didn't realise is, however, as he inspected row after row after row of modern German aircraft, when he then was driven down the road to the next German airbase, the German aircraft took off, flew on a circular route round, landed at the next airfield, changed the number plates so that he would think that they were different aircraft, and he actually inspected the same aircraft many times at different airfields. The German Air Force was nowhere near as powerful as the French government had been led to believe. On the 29th to the 30th of September, Chamberlain and the French give in. They decide the Czechs cannot fight. The French believe that they cannot win, and so they give in, and they hand the Sudetenland with its defences, with that thick defensive belt, over to Germany. In return, they get Chamberlain's famous piece of paper, in which Hitler says that he is prepared for peace now in our time. Hitler had wanted a war. Hitler had wanted to fight Britain, France and Czechoslovakia, and he felt that Chamberlain had outwitted him. Goebbels described him as an ice-cold English fox. However, the British government have different feelings. Duff Cooper resigns in protest for the surrender of the Sudetenland. War had been avoided in 1938. But could a war have been won in 1938? Well, let's examine the facts. The USSR had an agreement to defend Czechoslovakia. But would it have kept to it? Well, as the crisis began, it had mobilised its military units near Kiev and Minsk. They then discussed with the Romanians about whether they could move troops through Romania. Now, no Eastern European country wants to let a Russian army in. However, Romania knew it had obligations to Czechoslovakia. The Romanian government announced that it was prepared to offer the Red Army free passage to Czechoslovakia in line with its military obligations to Czechoslovakia. So the Russian army would have been allowed. I mean, what a sacrifice by the Romanian government. What an act of faith. But they were prepared to allow Russian military units to roll through their country to get into Czechoslovakia to help the Czechs. The USSR's foreign minister, Litvinov, had said that the USSR would deploy into Czechoslovakia and had asked for defence discussions with Britain and France, hoping to lead to a full military alliance against Nazi Germany. Secondly, German defences in the west between Germany and France were not complete. The German Chief of Army, Jodl, had said that he had 5 regular and 7 reserve divisions in the west, so a total of 12 German divisions, to face 100 French divisions. The French army would have had a massive superiority on that front. Now, in total, the Germans had at this time 75 divisions. Not all of them, of course, could be used against the Czechs. The Polish border would have to be watched, as would the West. Germany had concentrated 24 divisions to invade Czechoslovakia. The Czech army, to face these 24 divisions, had 35 well-equipped divisions of their own. And there would have been no surprise. The Czechs had known the Germans would be coming for 20 years, and they had known that this crisis had been brewing for weeks. The Czech army was well prepared for the coming storm. A German officer in 1939 had told a British journalist, "The Czech defences were impressive and impregnable to our army. We could have gone round them, perhaps, but we could not have gone through them." And Hitler's plan for the invasion of Czechoslovakia, Operation Green, was for a pincer attack by the 2nd and 10th Armies. That plan was incredibly risky, as all his generals had protested. And the German fleet was ill prepared. Germany had 3 pocket battleships, 7 destroyers, and only 3 ocean-going submarines to face the might of the Royal Navy, supported by the French Navy. Ludwig Begg, the Chief of Staff of the German Army until August 1938, and his successor Halder, and the head of Germany's military intelligence, Leicester, and head of the Interior Ministry, and the retired General von Lieben were all conspiring to overthrow Hitler if war broke out between Britain, France, Czechoslovakia against Germany. When Britain and France caved in over Munich, however, then the chances of this putsch succeeding faded and they drifted away. Also, the German people did not support war in 1938. We have again here the words of Henderson. War could rid Germany of Hitler. As it is, by keeping the peace, we have saved Hitler and his regime, which he considers, by the way, to be at least keeping Germany out of the hands of the communists. So this is not a criticism he was making there. He was saying that on the plus side, we've abandoned the Czechs, but at least we've saved Hitler. And Germany needed Czech resources. In September 1938, as it contemplated war over Czechoslovakia, it only had enough petrol for its army for 3 months. And let's consider the possible ramifications of Germany going to war with Czechoslovakia, Britain, France, and more than likely the USSR. Hungary and Poland could have joined either side. As it was, after the Munich Crisis, Poland would seize Teschen off the Czechs. Italy may have entered the war on Germany's side, but if so, its fleet would have been horribly exposed against the British and French fleet. Göring had threatened to bomb London flat, but simply lacked the resources to do so. And Japan could not have possibly have gotten involved in this war at this stage, as it was still bogged down fighting China and also Russia, as we often forget that in 1938 there were a series of battles between the Japanese and Russian armies, including the massive battle of Khalkhin Gol. And so the chance of the Second World War being a short, brief, relatively bloodless war passed in 1938. The Munich Crisis is one of those real lost moments. Chamberlain had meant well. He was horrified by the idea of war. And who can blame him? He had seen the horror of the trenches in the First World War. A lot of the British government had fought in the trenches. They knew how bad war could be. But, of course, with the benefit of hindsight, we can see that by sacrificing the Czechs, they didn't buy a lasting peace. But what they did do was squander the opportunity to deal with Germany while Germany was weak and while Britain and France had strong and powerful allies well placed. 1938 could indeed have been over within weeks or months and would probably now not be taught in schools in Britain. What an opportunity had been lost. It's time to pour the last of the pots. So, we have here the famous picture of Chamberlain coming back from his meetings with Herr Hitler and waving the paper, "Peace in our time. We regard the agreement signed last night and the Anglo-German naval agreement as symbolic of the desire of our two peoples never to go to war again. We are resolved that the method of consultation shall be adopted to deal with any questions that may concern our two countries, and we are determined to continue our efforts to remove possible sources of difference and thus contribute to assure the peace of Europe." And we have here Europe of 1938 after the Munich Agreement, with that bite taken out of Czechoslovakia, that so significant, so important bite. Now they say of Munich that in 1938 the British were not ready for war, nor were the French, but of course they forget that nor were the Germans. They say that at least Munich bought time for Britain and France to rearm. A really common exam question, or at least it used to be under an old syllabus, of did Munich allow Britain time to rearm? Well, after Munich, French rearmament prioritises fighters, artillery and anti-aircraft. They knew that the Germans had achieved good results by air and ground cooperation in the Spanish Civil War, but they still, despite that, produced no dive bombers. Now, the French air industry did grow by 500% in 2 years. 1/3 of the French government budget was now to go to the armed forces, but French industry was fatally inefficient. On average, French machine tools were 20 years old, whereas Germany's machine tools were only 7 years old. The Hotchkiss Tank Works still finished tanks by hand with files. The French industry made too many designs and too many prototypes. Now, the designs of French military equipment were excellent, but heavily delayed. Their 47mm anti-tank gun had been designed in 1935 and was indeed brilliant, but they didn't produce any until 1939, 4 years later. Strikes in French factories were common. although I suppose when aren't they? In the air, the aircraft, the D-520, was as good as a Spitfire or a Bf-109, but prime prototypes for it were only finalised in December of 1939. 80 of them would be made in time to be used against the Germans. But when the Germans were to eventually conquer France, they would find hundreds of them waiting at the factories, and they would use 430 of them themselves. So 80 were used against the Germans. The Germans used 430 of these excellent French fighters against the Russians in 1941. Gives you some idea of just how good these aircraft were. In despair, the French leader, Daladier, started to buy aircraft from the United States. 550 aircraft were ordered, but only 200 would be delivered by May 1940. Germany, however, gained heavily from Czechoslovakia. On the 15th of March 1939, German troops entered Prague unopposed, as the betrayed Czechoslovakia was occupied. The Czechs decided that, stripped of their defences, they couldn't possibly defend their country, and they knew now that Britain and France wouldn't help them. And so they decided that it wasn't worth dying when left on their own, and their army was ordered to lay down its weapons and hand its equipment over to the Germans. The Germans seized 1.5 million rifles, 750 aircraft, and 600 tanks from the Czechs, as well as 2,000 field guns. 1 in 10 of the German tanks that the Germans would use to invade France in 1940 were Czech-built tanks. The massive Skoda arms factory would be captured by the Germans intact and would continue to churn out war material for the Germans until the end of the war. At first, however, Chamberlain refused to rearm Britain after Munich. The Air Minister, Lord Sims, had said he would only support appeasement if it had bought time. But don't you see, Chamberlain said, it's bought peace. Chamberlain refused to allow the Navy to buy new convoy escorts. The army was told that it would not need to fight in Europe and was told to prepare for imperial policing yet again. Troops were sent to British Palestine in large numbers. Chamberlain decided that also if he helped the German economy, it would help avoid war. He suggested a new Anglo-German trade agreement and increased sales of oil and strategic war materials to the Germans. But the Germans couldn't afford to pay for British oil and British raw materials, so he decided to advance Germany alone to buy military equipment from the British. And so now in 1938, just after Munich, the British are giving Germany money so that Germany can use British money to buy British military supplies to help the German war preparations. On the 16th of March, after the fall of Czechoslovakia, rumours, however, started to circulate that the Germans planned an invasion of the Netherlands. And this changed everything. It was one thing for Germany to invade an Eastern European country. A Western European country is a very different matter as far as the British government is concerned. But despite this, and despite the fact that 14% of British men at home were unemployed, Chamberlain still decided against the creation of a large British army. The Germans began work on their Z-plan fleet, their fleet that was designed to challenge the British for control of the sea. The construction of 13 battleships, 4 aircraft carriers, and 15 pocket battleships. Chamberlain ordered the creation of a 6-division British expeditionary force and doubled the size of the Territorial Army. The French government tries to rebuild its system of alliances. It tries to reach out once again to the governments of Belgium, Romania, and Yugoslavia. But now it can offer little. After all, they'd already sacrificed Czechoslovakia. Who now would trust the word of the French? Despite that, Romania was still friendly to France and could have been wooed, and it did suggest a formal alliance with France if France would agree to buy large quantities of grain from Romania. But the French Minister of Agriculture vetoed the plan. On the 23rd of March, the Germans occupied Memel in Lithuania. And on the 31st of March, realising now that Germany had no intention of preserving the peace, Chamberlain guaranteed to go to the defence of Poland. 2 weeks later, the British also guaranteed the independence of Greece and Romania. In April, the British government introduced conscription, and talks began between Britain, France and Turkey. The British and French hoped that Turkey, still a significant regional power, could be wooed into a military alliance. But the talks broke down over the French occupation of the Turkish enclave in Syria, the Sanjak of Alexandretta, an area, by the way, that the Turks have recently reoccupied during Syria's difficulties. The British cabinet pressurised Chamberlain to discuss an alliance with the USSR. Reach out to the Russians, the cabinet said. A Gallup poll of British public opinion said that 87% of British public were in favour of an alliance with the USSR, but Chamberlain was sceptical. He had met with Hitler, but he refused to meet Stalin, or even to send Anthony Eden, his highly capable expert on foreign affairs. He said, "I am sceptical of the value of the Russian help, but I should not feel that our position would be so greatly weakened if we had to do without them," Chamberlain said. That month, April, Italy invaded Albania. And in May 1939, Hitler declared that war with Britain is inevitable. England is our enemy, and the showdown with England is a matter of life and death. Germany and Italy signed an alliance, the Pact of Steel, aimed against Britain and France. In August 1939, a delegation of relatively junior military officers was sent from Britain and France to talk to the USSR about a mutual plan to deal with Germany. The French sent General Dumenc, whereas the British sent the incredibly named Sir Reginald Plunkett Erle Drax, of all the people to send to a communist state. Neither have any clear instructions for the negotiations. The problem is Poland. Poland would never let Soviet troops into Poland. Marshal Voroshilev, the senior officer of the USSR, asked, "Do the French and British General Staff think Soviet forces will be admitted to Polish territory in order to make contact with the enemy if Poland is attacked?" The British and French delegates tried to hedge. They tried to avoid asking the question, but Voroshilev was having none of it. He said, "I want a clear answer to my very clear question." The French sent an officer to speak to the Polish General Staff. General Starowicz said, "We know the Russians better than you do. They are a dishonest people whose word is not to be relied upon by us or anyone else. With the Germans, we risk the loss of our liberty. But with the Russians, we risk the loss of our soul." Poland said no, they would not let Russian troops in. Drax also had to confess that Britain only had 4 divisions to fight the 100 British divisions. The Russians were shocked. Talks collapsed. The French, however, were not sad, as the French preferred an alliance with Poland over an alliance with the Russians. Now that might sound strange, but Poland at this time had the 4th largest army in the world, and of course had held off that Russian invasion in the 1919-21 war. Also, the Red Army had killed its officer class, and so as far as the West was concerned, was unable to fight. And also, of course, Poland had been given considerable credits to buy weapons off France since 1936. But Polish rearmament had assumed that Poland would not have to go to war until 1942. Of course, British rearmament had also assumed the same. They had an excellent tank, the 7TP, that was superior to the German tank at the time, the Panzer II, but they'd only made 14 of these excellent vehicles. On the 24th of August, Germany and the USSR signed the Nazi-Soviet Pact. Hitler is certain that Poland would now be another Munich. He was delighted. "Now Europe is mine," he said. He could not imagine why Britain and France would fight over Poland after they had failed to fight when it would have been Britain, France, Czechoslovakia and the USSR. He could not understand any kind of logic there. On the 25th of August, Hitler asked Mussolini what Italy would need to enter the war against the British. Mussolini said he needed 18,000 tons of coal, steel, oil, nickel and tungsten. There's no way that Germany can provide anything like that. And so Germany releases Italy from its alliance obligations and says that when war comes, Italy can stay out of it. On the 29th of August 1939, Poland, fearing German invasion, mobilised. But the British, knowing that mobilisation in 1914 had led to war, asks it not to. And so the Polish government cancels its mobilisation, which caused chaos when 2 days later they were forced to mobilise again. Poland mostly mobilised through the post service and from telegram messages. A message went out to mobilise, another message went out not to mobilise, and then a third message went out to mobilise. They did not necessarily arrive in that order. Some people got don't mobilise, mobilise, mobilise. Some people got mobilise, mobilise, don't mobilise. It caused absolute chaos with Polish mobilisation. But on the 1st of September 1939, Germany invaded Poland. Britain and France declared war on Nazi Germany. The British expected Ireland to enter the war along with the rest of the British dominions, but it doesn't. South Africa did consider its options, but decided to join the war with the rest of the British Empire, but 2 days late. And so now that war has come, let us examine the relative strengths of the combative powers in 1939. We have here Europe of 1939. Germany is not ready for war. It's short on tanks, vehicles and trained soldiers. It possesses little iron ore, no oil, copper, tungsten, bauxite or rubber, all of which vital. Rubber for tyres, tungsten for anti-tank rounds, bauxite, copper, they're all vital. It also lacks enough land to feed its population. Britain, on the other hand, has the world's largest fleet, the world's largest global trading network, and is also the world's largest arms exporter. It has access to imperial manpower and is already matching German aircraft production on its own. On the month war is declared, Britain produces 662 planes, whereas the Germans are producing 691. But of course the British will be supported by the French too. Now France was weak due to a low birth rate caused by the losses of the First World War. This was felt especially from 1935 onwards. There is a shadow over the birth rate of France, caused by so many young men being killed or being sent away to the front. And so they are short, relatively speaking, of young men. France had asked for a delay in declaring war and had wanted to accept Mussolini's offer of mediation between Britain, France and Germany. Chamberlain had actually considered it. Even as Poland was being invaded, Chamberlain did consider not declaring war and talking to Germany yet again. But in the House of Commons, the Tory MP Leo Amery and the Labour MP Arthur Greenwood had in the House of Commons forced him into a position to say that if the Polish army fought, Britain would declare war. Had the Polish army not fought, however, then it would probably indeed have been another Munich. On the 1st of September, the British government began evacuating 1.3 million children from the cities. The French enacted their Order Number 10. They were going to evacuate all the villages in front of or next to the Maginot Line. The French also started to conscript people, including, fatally, all their armament workers. The Renault armament factory lost 23,000 workers out of its 35,000 strong workforce. It caused absolute chaos, and it took months to find out where the French army had sent these highly skilled workers and send them back to the factories. Of all the waste of resources, to take men trained in producing fighter aircraft and tanks out of the factories making fighter aircraft and tanks, give them a rifle and tell them to dig trenches. Clearly they had to stay at home. It took months to send them back home. On the 1st of September also, the German U-boat U-30 sunk a passenger liner, the Athenia, carrying refugees to the United States of America. It caused outrage. Civilian liners were exempt from attack under the Hague Convention, the rules of war, which Germany had signed, and on the first day of the conflict had already ignored. On the 2nd of September, the RAF bombed the German fleet in port. Bombs hit the targets, hit the German warships, but failed to explode. The worst damage inflicted was when a British Blenheim bomber was shot down and crashed into the German warship, the Scheer. After that, Chamberlain restricted the RAF to drop in leaflets on Germany. It is hard to think, says the historian Holland, it is hard to think of a greater waste of resources than sending bombers to drop paper on your enemies, as the British bomber forces are now committed to dropping leaflets telling the Germans to make peace and to surrender, rather than dropping bombs upon them. Portugal, Britain's oldest ally, and indeed it's the oldest alliance in the world. Portugal offered to enter the war and declare war on Germany, but Britain told it that if it wanted to help, stay out of the war, in the hope that would keep Spain out of the war too, which they feared would enter the war on Germany's side and risk our control of Gibraltar. Now in Poland, by the 11th of September, German forces had swept across 1/3 of the country. Due to the mobilisation chaos, only 70% of the available units had mobilised. The British military advisor, Carton de Wiart, had one of the most incredible men of history, by the way, it's worth reading about him, had advised the Polish government to deploy behind the river lines, but his advice had been ignored. The Polish army fought bravely on the border, but was beaten. On the 7th of September, the French offensive was due to begin. The French were meant to attack into the Ruhr, to take the German industrial heartland, to support the Polish army, and it's meant to begin on the 7th. The German border with France is wide open. There is little between the French army and the Rhine and Berlin. The attack is delayed, however, until the 11th, and then delayed again until the 18th of September, then delayed again until the 19th. By the 19th, Warsaw is surrounded. Gamelin, the French general, had hoped that Poland would last 6 months. It fell in 20 days. The news then that Poland had been stabbed in the back by being invaded by the Soviet Union then forced the French to cancel their offensive. Instead, 10 French divisions advanced only 8 kilometres along a 12-kilometre front, occupying villages already abandoned by the Germans. I have here a report from the French army. 10th Platoon tried to continue the advance, but was halted by the fire of an automatic weapon. Now, a generation earlier, in the First World War, French soldiers had advanced over ground torn up by shell fire into a withering storm of machine gun bullets. But now, entire armies' advances are being held up by a single weapon. On the 4th of October, with barely making contact with the German army, the French army pulled back to the Maginot Line. And so the preparations begin, with Poland gone, to fight in the west. By September, the French have an army of 6 million men. They have 1,735 frontline aircraft and 1,600 aircraft in reserve. Some, like the D-520 fighter, are very good. The French bomber, the Farman 222, carried the heaviest bomb load in the world. The French tank, the S-35, is probably the best tank in the world at this time. And the French heavy tank, the Char B-1s, were better armoured than anything the Germans had. The French also have 11,200 artillery pieces to Germany's 7,710. But the French army is very short of anti-tank guns. Most divisions have none of those 47mm due to the delay in production, and are even short on of the obsolete 25mm, and so instead are equipped with First World War era anti-tank guns. We have here pictures of the Saar offensive occupying empty villages. Now, also, as soon as the war had begun, Britain and France had set up, however, a Supreme War Council, the SWC. Now, this hadn't happened in the First World War until 1917, so it was a great step forward in cooperation. I'll put those pictures of the Saar offensive back for now. They also set up the Joint Purchasing Committee, and an Anglo-French coordination committee to run the war economies. Neither happened in the First World War. Plans were made to make the two countries like each other a bit more. The British and French public were not necessarily keen on each other. The Marseillaise was to be played in the cinema after God Save the King. English and French was made compulsory in both countries. And English schools were told that they had to teach French cooking. All great things to do, but this is not really a priority for our Supreme War Council. On the 12th of September 1939, the First Supreme War Council meet in Abbeville to discuss how to fight. The plan they come up with is to delay and defend, and then to build up for a major offensive in 1941 or 1942 via Belgium to win the war. The German army, however, after victory in Poland, is desperately short of trucks. Now, against Poland, only 15 out of 54 divisions used had actually been motorised, and German industry is crippled by too many designs. They have 131 different designs of truck. There are few Germans that actually owned cars privately, so few Germans actually knew how to drive or had any mechanical skill. Spares were rare, complicated by the vast number of designs. By the end of the Polish campaign, then most of Germany's motorised forces were falling apart. Germany also lacks trained troops. They have 1.1 million fully trained men, and 0.7 million reservists who are partially trained, and 1.7 million First World War veterans. Despite that, however, despite the fact that his motorised forces are falling apart, on the 27th of September, Hitler demanded an immediate offensive against France. The army is horrified. It's short of ammunition, vehicles and spares. Poland is littered with broken down German trucks. A lack of training had also been costly in the invasion of Poland. Also, 1/3 of all Germany's tanks are the lightly equipped Panzer IIs. Most of Germany's artillery is horse-drawn. German armed forces were simply not as good as their propaganda machine suggested. We have visions of these well-equipped, modern German armed forces. The reality is very far from that. The British Expeditionary Force, however, it's small, but the plan was to keep it that way. The aim for the British was that at most to have 55 divisions by the end of 1941. 14 of these divisions were to come from Canada, South Africa, Australia and New Zealand. 4 would come from India, but it was to be the best equipped and most mobile army in the world, fully mechanised. They would use machines, not men, for this war, what was termed at the time a robot army. The British rifle, the SMLE, was the best rifle in the world, capable of 30 rounds a minute, whereas the German and French rifles could only manage 15. They had an excellent anti-tank gun, the 2-pounder. It could penetrate 50 millimeters of armour at 2/3 of a mile. No German tank had anywhere near that much armour. The thickest armour plating they had was only 30 millimeters. And the British tanks were broadly good for the time. They had problems, but for the time were not bad. The Matilda II had the thickest armour of any tank in the world. British industry was also gearing up for a long war. In March 1939, 16 new weapons factories had begun construction. In December of 1939, the British government began work on another 29 weapons factories. Gamelin wanted the British to send 2 armoured divisions to France to try and make up for the lack of French armoured divisions. Instead, however, the British sent 5 regular army divisions and 8 territorial army divisions to France. Now, the British knew that they were the junior partner in the war, and so they accepted French military command. Lord Gort, the chief of command for the British Expeditionary Force, accepted that he'd be commanded by the French C&C of the northeastern frontier. Now, Lord Gort was a very brave soldier. He'd won a Victoria Cross in the First World War, but, and I quote, he was the kind of Englishman who, while accepting foreigners as a regrettable necessity, he found foreigners wholly repellent. Despite this, however, he actually got on really well with the French generals. Unlike, however, the French generals who, when he was told, the French general staff were told they were going to command the British army as well, broke down in tears. On the 17th of September, U-29 sunk the British aircraft carrier Courageous. It's the first British warship to be sunk in the war, and it's a terrible loss to lose a major warship like that. On the 13th to the 14th of October, the German U-boat U-47 sneaked into the British naval base of Scapa Flow and sunk the British battleship, the Royal Oak. It's a massive shock to the British Empire as they lose a major warship right in their home port. But the U-boats don't have it all their own way, however. 3 U-boats were sunk in October, 6 more by the end of 1939, but those losses, let's face it, pale in comparison to the loss of the Royal Oak and the Courageous. Hitler is still pressing for a military assault on France. General Halder, Chief of Staff of the German Army, and von Lieb, the Army Group Centre Commander, and Beck, Halder's predecessor, all start to plot to assassinate Hitler if he makes the army launch its offensive in winter. Dönitz, meanwhile, the commander of the German submarine forces, starts to concentrate his U-boats into the so-called wolf packs. He believed that Britain would starve if he could sink 500,000 tons of merchant shipping a month. However, since 1937, the British government had offered grants to farmers so that they could improve farming to reduce imports in the event of war. The British government had actually stockpiled tractors and also prepared to increase British farmland by an extra 1 million acres to try and avoid starvation. At the outbreak of war, Britain could only supply 12% of its own wheat and 9% of its own butter, but they would very quickly improve that. By January 1940, the British government had already introduced food rationing to try and reduce imports still further. On the 17th of November 1939, at the Supreme War Council, the French suggested landing British and French troops at Salonika in Greece. Salonika in Greece, it's not on the map side, it just looks south of Sofia, really. Or possibly to land troops in Istanbul in Turkey. The troops would come from British and French forces in Syria, Palestine, and Egypt. The aim was to preempt any German invasion of the Balkans and to bring the Balkan countries into war against Germany. The French believed that the Balkan countries could provide 100 divisions to fight against Germany. The British believed, however, that would merely bring Italy into the war. On the 21st of November, the British finally blockaded Germany's exports as well as Germany's imports. This is devastating for Italy. 70% of all coal the Italians had came from Germany, but not across the land border, but instead was shipped by ship out of Rotterdam. Italy was forced to renegotiate with the British for supplies. The British offered to start selling Italy coal, and already 15% of Italy's coal came from Britain. But Mussolini refused. He said a great power should never beg, and so actually stopped to buy British coal entirely, causing real problems for Italian industry as they were deprived of British coal. On the 30th of November 1939, however, the USSR invades Finland. Initially, the Finnish army does rather well against the Russian army, and the British and French public opinion strongly swings behind the Finns. Now, as Germany was receiving a lot of economic aid from the USSR under the Nazi-Soviet Pact, the French decided that they wanted to attack the Soviet Union. The French decided that they wanted to go to war with Russia. Now, Britain also had an interest in the conflict, as they knew that Germany was heavily dependent upon iron ore from Sweden. In 1940 alone, Sweden would send 12 million tons of iron ore to Germany. The OKW, the German Economic Planning Unit, said Swedish iron ore deliveries are a basic demand of the German army. During the winter, the only way that Swedish iron ore could be shipped to Germany was via Norway, via the northern port of Narvik. Only in summer did the Baltic open up to allow ships to cross. The British wanted to help the Finns so that British troops in Finland could then cross into Norway, seize Narvik, and cut off German supplies of Swedish iron ore. Churchill, Lord of the Admiralty, wanted to mine the sea routes from Narvik to Germany to stop the arrival of this Swedish iron ore. The pros were that it would really hurt the German war economy, but the cons Well, Sweden and Norway might stop selling iron ore to Britain as well, and Norwegian merchant ships might stop working for the British, and it would mean that the British abandoned the moral high ground. Chamberlain rejected it, but did consider sending an expeditionary force to help the Finns fight off the Russians. In December of South America was the Battle of the River Plate. 3 British cruisers hunted down and sunk the German pocket battleship, the Graf Spee. The British and French, as 1940 began, finally reached a financial agreement. Britain would pay for 60% of the cost of the war, the French 40%, to reflect the differences in national wealth. But still they have done nothing to fight Germany. In January 1940, the Graf Spee's supply ship, the Altmark, is captured near Trondheim, Norway. 299 prisoners of war are released, and Norway says nothing about the Royal Navy entering Norwegian territorial waters. But then you have the Mecca Incident. It looked very much like the Germans were going to invade Belgium. The French concentrated their army on the Belgian border to meet them. But then, however, the Germans moved these troops away. The Belgian Chief of Staff, von Bergen, was sacked by the Belgian government for being too pro-French. The Belgians were determined to stay out of the war, and they were determined to keep strict neutrality. And yet, the Belgian Chief of Staff had started discussions with the French army, so he was sacked for being too pro-French. In February 1940, 56 British merchant ships were sunk by U-boats, but 3 U-boats were also sunk. On the 5th of February, the British rejected French plans to send an expeditionary force to northern Finland, to Petsamo, to fight against the Russians, but did consider sending troops to Narvik if Norway and Sweden agreed. They would then cross into Finland to help the Finns, but both Norway and Sweden refused to allow British troops to occupy them. To the British horror, however, the French decide that they want to send the troops anyway. On the 16th of February, Britain and France signed a trade agreement, but still had taken no real military efforts against the Germans. On the 18th of February, a joint British and French plan was finalised. 3 British companies were sent to the Alps to learn to ski, ready to fight in Norway. And a French Alpine brigade is told to prepare to go to Sweden to help the Finns, while 4 French divisions and 100,000 British soldiers were told to prepare to be sent to southern Norway if Germany invaded. On the 1st of March, Britain reimposed the coal blockade against Italy and seized 13 coal ships. Germany's economy, meanwhile, is suffering. Germany is reduced to begging Italy for 3,500 tons of copper. Mussolini manages to get this copper by seizing people's pots and pans out of houses and raiding churches to find it. But the Germans need that copper to make ammunition. That's what they don't have enough ammunition for another great push, and so they need to beg Italy for this copper. German imports have now fallen by 80%. Their industrial output is now lower than it had been during the Great Depression, when half of their industry had ceased. What industry Germany has operating is operating from raw materials given to them by the Russians under the Nazi-Soviet Pact. But thanks to the works of Todd and Soviet raw materials, German ammunition levels are finally starting to rise high enough to allow for an offensive. This is only achieved by great hardship and by cutting military production from elsewhere. On the 13th of March, Finland signs an armistice with the USSR. Britain and France had done nothing to help the Finns but talk. Public opinion forces Chamberlain to reshuffle his cabinet, whereas Daladier, the French leader, is in real trouble. On the 18th of March, Mussolini promised Germany that Italy would enter the war at the appropriate moment. At more or less the same time, the French General Staff suggests invading Italy, with 30 French divisions taken from the Maginot Line, plus 10 French and British divisions from the Middle East, to smash the Italians, to give the French army some combat experience, and to raise plummeting French morale, to secure the Mediterranean and the Middle East, and free up Allied naval power and resources. It was also to show the Germans that they meant business. Well, of course, that raises the question of why not simply attack the country you're already at war with, instead of planning to attack neutrals like Norway, Sweden, Italy, or Russia. Gamelin puts a stop to the plan. and still, however, there is nothing done against Germany. On the 20th of March, public opinion in France, disgusted at the failure to help the Finns, leads to a fall of Daladier. He's replaced by Reynard, but Reynard is approved as leader of France by just one vote. Now, he gets on well with Churchill, and he's an Anglophile, and he speaks English, but Chamberlain hates him because of his friendship with Churchill. He proposes bombing Russia, in particular the Russian oil fields around Maykop, Grozny and Baku, to stop Russian oil being sent to Germany. Chamberlain hits the roof, knowing that would lead to war with the Russians. Instead, the British suggest a plan proposed by Churchill. They plan to drop sea mines into the River Rhine, which of course flows from France to the sea through Germany, as German river traffic on the Rhine is vital to German industry. The French, however, refuse, because they're afraid that if they mine the German rivers, the Germans will retaliate by bombing French cities. And so on the 28th, when Reynard attends his first Supreme War Council, he vetoes the plan. But discussions do begin about mining the sea routes from Narvik to Germany. On the 30th of March, the French Admiral Darlan warns Gamelin that swift action in Norway might be required. It's well timed, as Hitler is terrified that Britain and France would seize Swedish iron ore, so launches an invasion of Denmark and Norway. The entire U-boat force of 31 boats is brought out at the Atlantic and redirected to the Battle of Norway. And so the war turns hot. In April, Reynard suggested that the British and French fleets should force the Dardanelles, as they tried in 1915 at Gallipoli, to sail into the Black Sea to attack Soviet ships sailing Russian oil to Germany via Romania. The French also, however, refused to mine the River Rhine again. On the 4th of April, Chamberlain boldly says on the BBC that Hitler has missed the bus, and Britain starts to prepare to lay mines in Norwegian waters. Just in case, they say, Plan R4. It had taken 7 months of arguing to agree. And now, of course, it's too late, as the summer weather means that the Baltic is opening up, and so the mining is useless. But on the 7th of April, an RAF reconnaissance plane spots a German naval invasion heading for Norway. 30 British bombers attack it, but miss their targets. The Royal Navy puts to sea. British troops had already loaded onto 4 British cruisers at Versailles. Churchill demands that the British troops get off the British cruisers to allow these cruisers to dash out into the North Sea to go and engage them. It's a fatal mistake for those troops. And so the fighting in Norway. On the 8th of April, the British destroyer Glowworm spots the German heavy cruiser Hipper and 4 destroyers. This British ship is outgunned. Here's the photo taken from the Hipper. That ship on fire in the distance is the Glowworm. There is no way the Glowworm could harm the Hipper seriously. The Glowworm could have ran, but the Royal Navy does not run. The Glowworm moved and charged towards the Hipper, guns blazing, shells bouncing off the Hipper until it rammed the Hipper, killing everyone on the Glowworm. As you look at that picture, everyone on that British ship knows they're going to die. And they use their own ship as effectively a missile to try and harm the German heavy cruiser Hipper. And they do great damage to it, shearing off part of its armour plating with their deaths. The British battle cruiser Renown is told to try and stop the Germans landing at Narvik. Reynard also tells Gamelin to send French troops to Norway. On the 9th of April, the Renown finds the German battle cruisers Scharnhorst and Gneisenau. Both of these 2 warships, that's 2 modern German battle cruisers against 1 rather obsolete British battle cruiser. However, the British battle cruiser engages and drives the Germans off, with the Gneisenau badly damaged. But the Germans offer Norway and Denmark a chance to surrender and accept German protection. King Haakon VII of Norway refuses, but to their shame, Christian X of Denmark accepts. In Denmark, there is little fighting, and it's soon occupied after a paradrop and 5 separate naval landings. German planning had been swift, precise, and ruthless. Everything that British and French planning had not been. Norway's government ordered the army to mobilise, but but only then discovered that they actually didn't know how to mobilise their army. They'd never done it before, so they sent the letters out by post. Most of those letters wouldn't be delivered until after the Second World War. German merchant ships, however, had already docked in Norwegian ports, filled with ammunition and supplies for a German invasion. At Stavanger, the port and the solar airfield are contested in the first contested paradrop of the war. Norwegian forces, however, do resist the Germans. The new German cruiser, the Blucher, one of only 5 in their fleet, is sunk by a Norwegian shore battery near Oslo. A second, the Lutzow, is heavily damaged. Oslo falls, but the resistance from the shore batteries, the air force and the coastal defence ships allow King Haakon and the Norwegian government to escape inland, taking with them the entire country's gold reserves. That day, German mountain troops managed to evade the Royal Navy and land at Trondheim, Bergen and Kristiansand. The Royal Navy had believed the Kriegsmarine weren't going to Norway but trying to break out into the Atlantic. On the 10th of April, British and German destroyers clashed at Narvik. One British destroyer was sunk, but they brought down 2 German destroyers and a supply ship carrying all the German mountain division's heavy guns. On the 11th of April, the French army asked Belgium for permission to enter Belgium, but they refused. The British and French decide that if the Germans attack the Netherlands, they'll occupy Belgium anyway, invited or not. The British battleship the War Spite sinks 5 German destroyers at Narvik. The German U-boats are really struggling in the campaign. 5 German torpedoes had hit the battleship War Spite, but not one had exploded. The U-boats actually score 14 hits on British cruisers and 10 on British troop transports, and another 10 hits on destroyers, and not a single one of those explode. They don't explode because they're using advanced magnetic detonators, but those magnetic detonators don't work this close to the Arctic Circle. Had the Germans used more basic technology, it could have been a disaster for the Royal Navy. As it is, they escape with relatively light losses. On the 12th of April, the French still are struggling to get involved in the fighting in Norway. Reynard Hadar had been forced to look up the Norwegian ports in an atlas. Gamelin had been told to prepare to send French troops to Norway. However, he had failed, and he offered Daladier his resignation. But Reynard is the boss, not Daladier. Daladier, of course, has resigned. Reynard hates Gamelin, but that's why Gamelin offered his resignation to Daladier. He knew that Daladier would refuse it. He knew that Reynard would accept it. Britain was told that the British government told those troops that had got off the cruisers to reload onto cruisers to go to Norway. There's absolute chaos. Some troops have no snowshoes, some are so heavily laden they can't walk, some have no equipment whatsoever. Most have no mountain training. The kit bags they'd unloaded from the ships can't be found. Some are never found. We still have no idea where some of that equipment actually went. No heavy guns or vehicles are loaded onto the ships, as we assumed that Norway would give them to us, despite the fact that we should have known that Norway had no heavy guns or vehicles. But British troops are sent to Narvik and Trondheim. But the Narvik troops arrive with Trondheim maps and vice versa. A lot of the troops that are sent to Trondheim arrive with maps to Anderlasne. The British send bombers, but few fighters, giving the Germans control over the skies of Norway. The British wanted to concentrate just on Narvik for its vital port, but the French persuaded us to send troops to Trondheim and Aldernes as well. On the 11th to the 14th of April, the RAF began to mine the Danish Straits, but it was too late. The British en route to Trondheim suffered a disaster when their supply ship, the Cedar Bank, was lost, carrying all the heavy equipment to a U-boat. They arrived with nothing but rifles and light machine guns on the 22nd of April. The 148th Brigade arrived without artillery, air support and short of ammunition. They joined a badly equipped Norwegian unit, equipped with pre-1900 artillery, but showing great grit, they attacked the German paratroopers and overran them. But that victory was too little, too late to save Norway. The Norwegian army had tried to concentrate at Lillehammer, the largest town in central Norway, but it's destroyed by our air attacks before being overrun by German armour. French troops finally arrived in Norway, but the Norwegian campaign is done. On the 30th of April, central and southern Norway are evacuated. Narvik was in German hands but besieged by British troops. On the 6th of May, the British besiegers would be joined by Polish and French troops too. Reynard, meanwhile, had staked his reputation on the Norway campaign. He's furious at the British withdrawal from the central and southern Norway and accused the British of lacking energy. The British are furious with the French. I have here the words from their government. The French have done absolutely nil. It is our ships and our aircraft that are shot down. Daladier, on the other hand, said, we should ask the British what they want to do. They pushed for this war and then they wriggle out of it as soon as it's a matter of taking any action that directly affects them. A criticism that could easily have been levelled at the French government. On the 7th of May, our last day, I suppose, of this talk, Chamberlain suffered a fatal humiliation in the House of Commons. His position was untenable after the 2-day Norwegian debate. Leo Amery quoted Cromwell, "You have sat here too long for any good you are doing. Depart, I say, and let us have done with you. In the name of God, sir, just go." Chamberlain's war was over. But the day after the Norway debate, the 10th of May, the German invasion of France and the Low Countries had begun, which is where we will continue the story of the Second World War next week, when we see if the British and French, after wasting so much time, can hold in the critical battle for France and the Low Countries. Just give me a minute, please. We have here a picture. This is Paul Reynard, and this is Neville Chamberlain, Daladier, Hitler, Mussolini, and Count Chiano about to sign the Munich Agreement. If I can just load up some questions, I'll try and deal with. Oh, I pressed the subtitles button. I do apologise. I'll see what questions I can take. But thank you for joining me. Right. So I was to. Hopefully you'll see this first question. I don't know who this question is. Weren't serious cuts to Britain's defence budget brought in by Winston Churchill as Chancellor of the Exchequer in the late 1920s, especially around 1926? Yes, they were. And in the 1920s, it has to be said, British defence forces were further cut, and heavily so. Although it must also be said that in the 1920s, particularly when the defence budget was cut in 26, it was hard to see who we were arming against. However, the failure to, I suppose the disastrous failure to rearm, is in the 1930s. Had Britain rearmed in the 1920s, that could actually have harmed the British preparations for war. That might sound odd, but it would have meant that Britain would have spent a lot of money on equipment that would have been badly obsolete. Fighters like the Gloucester Glebe, they were never going to be of any use in a war even in 38. Italy really suffered by rearming too fast, well, too early rather, which was why so much of their equipment was frankly junk. But yes, you're right, serious cuts were put in by Winston Churchill as Chancellor of the Exchequer. And of course, Churchill also had the disastrous decision to put us on the gold standard, which really damaged British industrial interests in favour of Britain's financial power. So thank you for that question. I hope that answered it for you. I think I've got time for one more question, and then I will call an end to our talk for the evening. Thank you for joining us, by the way. So if I publish this, here we go. I was struck by the emphasis of the failure to secure the Belgian border. It seems to me that this would have been very important, as that's the way the Germans had come in the First World War. Was the urgency to do this not felt enough for France and Belgium to put their differences aside for long enough to collaborate on this? Well, it's a good question. I think that the answer is that Belgium, after it cancels its alliance with France, is determined to be neutral. They knew that the Netherlands had successfully remained neutral in the First World War, and if they hope that if they show equal preparations to defend against both the French and the Germans, that they will be spared, that they will be able to sit out the war while France and Germany fight on their border. It's a vain hope, it's a false hope, but I suppose you can't blame people for being desperate to avoid another slaughter like the First World War. And I think for peaceful people who view all war with horror, it's hard to understand that there might be other people who are prepared to go to war. And so from the Belgian point of view, they think, well, if we offer no no trespass, as it were. If we don't wrong the Germans, surely they won't wrong us. It's naive, of course. We can see that particularly with hindsight. But given how bad the First World War had been, of course, you can't blame them. But yes, the French had been desperate for the Belgians to come back in on their side, even in the early weeks of 1940. But Belgium wouldn't accept French help, just in case it caused a German invasion. Well, thank you very much, everyone. I think I've taken up an extra 3 minutes of your time. I hope you'll forgive me. The talk next week is a trifle shorter, but I hope you'll join me next week as we carry on the story up to 1941, and we see how France copes with the test that's coming its way as we examine 1940 to 41. Thank you very much, and good night.